Episode 28, Kill the King, was pretty incredible. The anime original content for the 1000-Year Blood War is easily the single greatest thing about the adaptation so far. It does come at the trade-off of several cutscenes and an overall production that unfortunately doesn't come close to matching Kubo's presentation for the manga, but if we're focusing purely on the content without consideration for how it has been presented, I do think it's fair to say the first 28 episodes are superior to the first 120 or so chapters of the manga they've covered so far. Of course, Kubo's artwork is like half the reason why Bleach is as effective as it is for me, but that's a conversation for another day. The original content of the anime is mental. From Sasakibe's involvement in Yhwach's original defeat, to Ichibe sealing the Almighty in exchange for Panaida in a flashback prior to the battle 1000 years ago, to an extended Squad Zero showcase including Senjumaru Shutara's Bankai, to the Uryu POV in Season 1 with him slowly unraveling Quincy mysteries before he is assumed into the Vandenreich, the additions so far have been truly monumental, and that is just to name a few. They have dramatically altered the complexion of some very important elements of the manga, and it is undeniable that by the time the fourth core wraps up, the anime and manga versions of Bleach's final arc will be very different experiences. This 5-second clip massively improves Sasakibe's character as a whole. The revelation that this man played an instrumental role in defeating Yhwach alongside Yamamoto strengthens the relationship of the two, while giving so much weight to the fact that Sasakibe was the first victim of the Vandenreich's attack, and adding an incredible irony to the nature of Yamamoto's death, backstabbed by the pitiful reveal that he was fighting a fake Yhwach all along. And that's just a 5-second addition. There are several more that have done wonders for the arc. I have a very big video essay planned for the near future discussing the entire adaptation at length and directly comparing it to the source material. I'll be sharing my thoughts on the content, the presentation, my preferences between the anime and manga, my hopes for the future, and just everything 1000-Year Blood War anime related in extensive detail. So for today, I want to focus solely on the Yhwach additions. In fact, I want to compile everything we know about Yhwach's origin and propose a timeline of events up to the start of the 1000-Year Blood War arc. To do this, I'll be looking at the manga in its entirety, some of Can't Fear Your Own World, and of course the anime original content, so there is your spoiler warning. Without further ado, let's dive straight into this. The initial origin point for Yhwach is still very unclear. However, with this scene from the beginning of episode 28, I'm gonna go out on a limb and propose that Yhwach is in fact the son of Reo as he claims, that this is not just a symbolic gesture but rather quite literal, and that alongside Ichibe and of course Reo himself, Yhwach predates the current million-year-old world. The current status quo where life and death cycle to and fro. The three worlds of Soul Society, Hueco Mundo and the world of the living. Yhwach outdates this shape of the cosmos, but I do not believe he retains clear memories of this time. Yhwach was born again in the current world a little over 1000 years ago, but we'll get there shortly. I think the opening scene of episode 28, while abstract and heavily symbolic in nature, paints a pretty vivid picture of the Yhwach timeline. The sequence begins with the almighty eyes showcasing 4 shiny gem-like pupils that resemble agate stones, which ties in neatly to Yhwach's Ashvalen chant that mentions eyes of agate in the same verse as Coffin of Adonaios, which we later learn is the name of the Soul King. Fun fact, but we actually see this name on Sorkin's journal in episode 6 of Core 1. The Tongue of Gold and Skull Cup are both very interesting, so if you have any theories on that, please do share them. But the point is, this sequence begins with the Soul King's eyes opening, meaning this is a vision directly tied to the will of the Soul King, which Ichigo felt upon arriving in the Soul King Palace, potentially even as a message from the Reo to Ichigo. We know, thanks to the novels, that the will of the Soul King is a ubiquitous force present within the world of Bleach, and it's fair to assume that this force is amplified in the realm where what's left of his body is sealed. And as such, this vision, which spans through time at a rapid rate, is coming directly from the Soul King's perspective. The lake or ocean we see is likely what the primordial world looked like in its entirety. This is the original form of the three worlds before they were divided by the Soul King. It is an infinite ocean of swirling reishi, which Ichibe claims would have slowly melted into chaos. The world being a large body of water during this primordial age is something that can be found in various religious contexts, But even from a scientific perspective, our planet was just water before any land was formed. We see Yhwach, or rather the one who would come to be known as Yhwach, as an onlooker, watching his father in this endless ocean make the decision that would change the world forevermore when something very interesting happens. Yhwach sinks and regresses, presumably into the swirling ocean that was the primordial world, as the Reo is in the process of splitting it into 3 realms. It seems, to me at least, as if the process of creating the world of Bleach as we know it in the current day forced Yhwach into that state of the blackened, senseless baby with no agency who we met in chapter 565. The baby that would go on to be worshipped thanks to the miracles it wrought through the pieces of its soul it would bestow onto those that came into contact with it. This is where the video shifts into theory crafting, because I'm completely convinced that this form of Yhwach is thanks to none other than Ichibe Hyosube. Their meeting in the Empire of Light was not their first, and why should it be? If Yhwach truly predates the 3 worlds, surely the only other person we know who is not only that old, but directly involved in the splitting of the worlds would have interacted with him. The son of the Soul King, the king of the Quincy, the one who would come to be known as Yhwach. It's very possible that their original name has been permanently brushed into the ether by the Mad Monk. I have had this theory for a very long time, long before the latest episode released. Yhwach's appearance as a baby covered in black ink, the same black that Ichibe governs as the author from a meta-narrative perspective, is something that had always connected the 2 characters thematically, but now it's very likely that the connection runs even deeper, that the reason Yhwach was in this state to begin with is thanks to Ichibe's power, thanks to Ichimonji. And I think what really sells this theory is this page, the birth of Yhwach as we know him in the present, a nameless boy worshipped by those around him who began to refer to him as the god they worshipped, a name he decided to make his own. This presentation here is very deliberate. We see a nameless Yhwach covered in black, 4 boxes with Yhwach's stolen name overlapping them, followed up by a young, unmasked Yhwach. He emerges from the darkness the second he gains a name, which looks like it's overlapping Ichibe's ink. There's almost an undeniable tie to the Mad Monk here. Bringing it back to the anime editions, this shot of Yhwach's tears that we see is very interestingly framed. It comes not long after the worlds were split, which has led to the popular interpretation that Yhwach is shedding tears for his father here. Now, I'm not sure if I fully buy into this interpretation, because it's very clear in other instances that Yhwach despises the Reo for the decision that he made, that he is carrying out this holy war out of a vendetta against his father and the world he chose to create. And the shot of Yhwach tearing up comes at the very second we begin to hear the cries of souls returning to him, which suggests a connection there. Yhwach's underlying motivation is his fear of death as a concept, and that was tempered by his experiences as the Quincy King, by the visions and cries of the Quincy he is connected to reaching their demise. However, I do really like the idea that Yhwach is crying for the Reo, as it makes for a very cool parallel to Zangetsu's tears before Ichigo performed the final Getsuga Tensho, which, as a sacrifice of power to protect the world, is fundamentally very similar to the Reo's sacrifice. The way this opening scene of the episode ends with this close-up on Reo also doubly confirms to me that this flashback vision thingy is in fact something he is responsible for, like I said earlier in the video. Slightly related side note, but the eyes of Reo being agates, these multicolored flashy gem-looking pupils, reminds me of Shinken Hakyoken in opening 3, as well as Ichigo's different Reiatsu pouring out of him during the Irazusando training. It's mainly just the explosion of color, but I wouldn't put something like that past Kubo. Perhaps there's a connection there. Let's go over what I've established so far. Yhwach was born sometime predating the splitting of the worlds into 3, so at least over 1 million years ago, and it seems the process of the splitting itself is intrinsically connected to Yhwach's condition in some way. I think the inherent paradox that underlines Yhwach's character, his hatred for death despite literally requiring others to die as a means of living, is something physically tied to the nature of the world Reo created, which is why Yhwach wants to merge the worlds to free himself of this condition. Given that Ichibe was responsible for carrying out the intentions of the ancient noble clan heads, and this one shot from Core 2, I also think it's a valid assumption that Ichibe and Ichimonji is responsible for Yhwach's blackened appearance in chapter 565, and that marks the birth of Yhwach as we know them. The Almighty, I think Yhwach awakened slowly as he monopolizes the race of Quincy's with pieces of his soul, since that's the way he regained all of his other bodily functions. The Almighty is a power shared by the Reo. It stands to reason that this is not something Ichibe can resist with his ink, in the same way that Ikomikidomoe consuming pieces of Reo allowed him to break free of Ichibe's power. Once Yhwach took that name for his own, he was born again, including the Almighty. And that brings us to another anime edition, the conversation between Yhwach and Ichibe in the Empire of Light. This scene directly correlates with what I just said. Because Ichibe cannot resist the Almighty with his ink, he needed to come up with another plan which involved forsaking the left arm of the Reo in exchange for sealing Yhwach's eyes. In this scene, we see Ichibe showing Yhwach visions of the past, of the original sin, and also chastising Yhwach for his ignorance. This is technically a hole in my theory that Yhwach was around for the original sin. However, that's why I said I don't think Yhwach retains clear memories of that time. He was reborn with a new clean slate in 565 when he stole the name Yhwach, and the only thing that carried on from his past was the Almighty. That's my interpretation for now, which is of course privy to change depending on the information we receive in the future. This would make the meeting between Ichibe and Yhwach one where Ichibe comes to finish the job per se, to rid Yhwach of the only thing he couldn't deal with a million years ago by sealing the Almighty. Timeline wise, this also makes sense because we know the Reo was mutilated sometime after the worlds were split and he was sealed in the crystal, which is also after Yhwach regressed into a baby, meaning if Ichibe was responsible for that, like I'm theorizing, he wouldn't be able to weaponize Panida to seal the Almighty at the time since it was still part of the Reo's body. But he can now, and he successfully seals Yhwach's eyes. And that brings us to the original Blood War 1000 years ago, finally confirming the widely believed headcanon that Yhwach did not have access to the Almighty against Yamamoto, which is the main reason for his loss. And then he was sealed for 1000 years, which is something I'm really hoping the anime further elaborates on because I'm still unsure what exactly this entails. The natural assumption is that Yhwach returned to the state of a blackened baby, just like Yugaram said he would if he stopped absorbing souls. What better way for them to know this than it having literally happened 1000 years ago? But if that's the case, how did the Kaiser Gesan come about? How did the Quincy know Yhwach would return in exactly 999 years? Perhaps Yhwach had a vision with the Almighty before it was sealed by Ichibe. Perhaps he knew he was going to lose against Yamamoto and needed to in order to return 1000 years later in an age where Ichigo exists and he can be manipulated to slay the Reo. We don't know. We don't even know how Yhwach was sealed and what that looked like. And with how conservative Kubo can be when it comes to sharing information, I'm not expecting us to ever learn these things fully. But that's the Yhwach timeline in a nutshell. This is a much shorter, much simpler video than usual because I had some thoughts I wanted to share and I'm getting a little overwhelmed with trying to make every single video as good as possible. So I hope you enjoyed despite this being a pretty basic video in comparison to my standard uploads. I am considering uploading videos like this on my second channel, but that's something in the distant future for now. Thank you guys for watching and please do share any thoughts you have in the comments below.